Timor has been known since basically the past for its sandalwood and beeswax. Chinese came here, they were doing some trade, then we became famous basically at recent times for some of oil. So all of these three things are natural resources. Lately, we've been more known for war and conflict. The other side of the talk that I'll be, focusing a bit. So I'll be talking about the environment, conflict, and how these two things are related, and talk of it in terms of peace building process in Timor. I am a biologist. I don't know much about peace building, but I'll be asking some questions. Let's start with Chinese came, did trade, Portuguese came, colonized us. We had the terrible, unfortunate case of having the worst colonizers ever, because they didn't leave a lot of infrastructure or much behind. Then the Japanese came, invaded us. There wasn't much infrastructure to ruin, but they did some pretty nasty things to people. Then the Portuguese came back, and then we declared independence, and then the Indonesians came, and they were here for like a couple of decades. And it would be naive to think that basically throughout this time that we were occupied and invaded, that trauma is not present in Timor society. Unfortunately, some of our leaders have expressed quite publicly in national parliament that there is no such thing as trauma in Timor. I would say that is not right. If we look at the history of what happened in Timor throughout time, it'd be naive to think that there's no trauma, and it would be naive to think that conflict didn't impact natural resources here. It impacted natural resources beyond the use of napalm, and yes, the Indonesians did use napalm here, and so did they use Agent Orange. It goes beyond that. It goes beyond deforestation that was backed up by the Indonesian military. It goes beyond exploiting resources and biodiversity and actually selling a lot of the species that we no longer have. It goes beyond that. Conflict impacted natural resources by changing people's connection and relationship to nature. And it did that in a profound way. Imagine you live in a village up in a mountain, and then suddenly you have to run away. In the village that you're from, you know the resources, you know your sacred forest, you know your fountains, you know how to name trees and birds and everything in your own language. And then suddenly war comes. You have to run to Matabiam. You stay there. Completely different environment. You don't know what you see. You don't know how to make use of it. And most importantly, you don't know how to use it sustainably. So and then, imagine, well, Matabiam, Basa de Apoio collapsed. You have to basically surrender. The Indonesians, what they did is they reallocated communities and populations throughout the country. You were very lucky if you were reallocated in the same district that you actually came from. You're very lucky. And if that happened, you'd be put in a different place, in a new town, or in a completely different village, where you would absolutely have no idea of how to use the resources around you to feed you. So of course, if you're facing this condition, and if you need to feed yourself, you're going to change the way in which you interact with nature. And you're going to look at nature as something, what can I take out of it? And completely forgot that I need to use it in a sustainable way. There was one generation that have been doing these practices. The younger generation, the generation that followed, they have no idea of how to interact with that environment in a sustainable way. They have seen their parents doing these unsustainable practices, and they have no recollection of the connection that their parents had in the place where they come from. There's no sense of sacred forests or sacred fountains or any of that. So that changes the way in which people interact with nature. And here comes the restoration of independence, and we're free again. You see a lot of peace building, peace building programs, peace building for this and peace building for that. We're building peace in Timor. But if you look at these programs, and if you look at some stats, I like numbers. If you look at very simple statistics like the majority of the population in Timor rely on fisheries and subsistence farming for their livelihoods, say 80%. And if you know that climate change and all of these threats that weren't caused by Timorese, but caused by people in general, us as a global community, it's going to impact resources and it's going to lead to scarcity, and scarcity of resources is going to be the main cause of conflict. What peace are we building if we're not building in natural resource management into our programs? Who are we building this peace for? It's certainly not for the farmer or for the fisherman. So basically, these two questions were questions that I sort of been going backwards and forwards and trying to figure out, how can I do something? How can I bring some of the knowledge that I've learned outside back to Timor, share it with community members and people that were put in the awful situation of being moved and being probably the second generation in a place where they don't have a very deep connection or understanding of these systems. How do we start this dialogue? How am I going to bring in knowledge that can help them improve the way in which they're looking after their resources? It's very tricky, it's very hard to start a dialogue. There's several reasons for that. One is that at university, we are not trained to have adequate communication skills. I'm trained as a zoologist. I can identify bugs. I usually did bugs and numbers, but I can't communicate or relate to people appropriately. So that was a very big gap in my training. I had to learn. I learned the hard way in VKK. I was talking and somebody was sharpening the machete. I was like, oh shit, this is not good. Take note, don't do that again. And over 10 years, I think we've managed to develop some nice tools that can be used in Timor and are adequate to the context. What I would like, the main message is basically, it's very simple, 3 simple points, and it's that people need nature to thrive, nature needs people to care, and people need people to care. When you go out there as a field biologist, this is for everybody, all the Timorese that are exploring careers. If you want to be a natural resource manager, you really need to care for the people that you're going to work for. You're providing a service. You really have to be passionate about what you do, because you're not going to get a big salary, and the work you're going to you'll encounter a lot of conflict, and you need to develop the skills on how to deal with that. You really need to want to help people, and you really need to care for the communities that you go and work for. Because if you don't do that, you end up going to that community and causing more harm than good. And unfortunately, this happens it's quite common. And the other, I think, suggestion I would do also to all the colleagues that are going to embark in a career is basically, numbers are amazing. They're fantastic. They can tell us so much stuff. But if you forget that these numbers are ways in which statisticians used to tell us a story, and if you forget that these numbers are associated with people, then you become really good at setting up activities and designing metrics to measure how many of these you've done, and you become terrible at designing for outcomes such as improving human well-being and actually have impact in communities. So that's basically my talk. Thank you, guys.